So, this is what I find to be kind of the interesting.
Can I ask a clarifying
Yes,
question?
yes.
So then for the Musawwada, how do they explain that you can actually follow the system and then end up with different rulings? So they think that everything's right?
Yes, because there's no real thing, there's no reality to it. Okay? So as they say, there's no contradiction. There's no contradiction for Abu Hanifa to say Nabidh is jaiz, and Shafi'i say that Nabidh is haram. Because, this is the important point, we're not talking about essences, we're talking about legal judgments. Okay? So if I'm a follower of Abu Hanifa, what is the rule about drinking Nabidh for me? Well, it's jaiz. And if I'm now, what would be a problem, so Shafi'i's rule doesn't apply to me because I reject it. So there's no contradiction. There's no subjective contradiction in the fact that Shafi'i says that Nabidh is haram. Right? Because what we're not saying, according to Musawwada, is that God has one rule. We deny, that's precisely what we deny. What we're saying is that the rule that applies to us is the rule that we believe, right, is most in concordance with what God has expressly revealed. Okay, so if I conclude Nabidh is not substantially similar to Khamr, then I drink it. If I believe that it is, then I don't. Okay? But there's no contradiction because contradiction in law only arises if the same person is commanded to do X and not do X. And that doesn't take place. Because only Shafi'i is obliged not to drink and Abu Hanifa is permitted to drink. So there's no contradiction. There's just two different rules. Okay? Yeah.
Is that taqlid use the adilla of the amara depends only on the psychological feelings?
That's Ghazali's argument.
Or there are no usul fiqh which is coming, which like put the adilla on borders, and these usul fiqh are logical.
Yeah, but the point, but see, there are two issues here. Okay, is one, there's always a question of the historicity of the dalil. Everything but the Quran, you can't say with certainty is a dalil. Because even a sahih hadith, according to the muhaqqiqun, right, only provide a likelihood of attribution to the Prophet. Okay? Only the Quran is transmitted with tawatur. Tawatur means mass transmission in such a fashion, mass independent transmission in such a fashion that it's rationally impossible to believe it could have been concocted. But that does not apply to hadith, because most hadith are narrated by a small number of people. They could have been fabricated. Even if we believe, the chance of that is quite small. But reason does not allow us to exclude that as a possibility. Okay, because they're narrated by very small numbers of people. Okay, we have to assume that the narrators are credible, adala, etc. But these are what they would say sifat batina. We have no truth. We don't have access to the truth of these things, right? That's why we say, hadith sahih yufid al-dhann, not certainty. That's one thing. So they call that thubut. So lots of these adilla are only conjectural in terms of thubut. Secondly, they're conjectural in terms of meaning. Right? So even if you and I agree, I can go give examples of this, that a certain hadith is sahih, and there's no doubt, or at least we don't doubt that the Prophet ﷺ said it, we can nevertheless interpret it in 180-degree opposite way. And that's happened. Right? And again, there's no way of adjudicating objectively which understanding is the correct one. Okay? So Ghazali is saying in these circumstances, the reason for that is because these aren't rational proofs. A rational proof, a dalil, does not admit of difference of opinion. You cannot disagree with the Pythagorean theorem and be a reasonable person. Okay? But I might as well give an example. There are plenty of hadiths that we would all agree are sahih, but we would we would all be rationally justified in disagreeing about what they mean as a matter of hukm. So I'll give one example. Man ahya ardan mayitan fahiya lahu. Well-known Sahih Hadith. All the Sunni Imams accepted it as Sahih, but 3 different rules. So Abu Hanifa says that no one is permitted to reclaim unused land without the prior permission of the Imam. Shafi'i says you're always permitted to reclaim unused land, whether the Imam gives you permission or not. Malik said you're permitted to reclaim unused land in land distant from cities, falawat, but not if it's close to the city. Then you need the permission of the Imam. None of them rejected the hadith, but they all come up with 3 very different rules. So Ghazali says that's because they have different, he attributes it to their psychology. Okay? But the main reason is it's not the kind of rational proof that we have in mathematics or philosophy or logic. Okay? So you're inevitably going to get substantial disagreements about what they mean. Okay? Now, so what I'm trying to say is Ghazali and Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi represent radical ends, the opposite ends on a spectrum of going from objectivity to subjectivity. Right? Now, Fakhruddin al-Razi comes and introduces a medial position, which I think illustrates, the idea of aesthetic judgment. So he agrees with Ghazali that the Mukhatti' position is rationally absurd. Because we can't talk about truth and falsehood in ijtihad without positing an ontological existence for ijtihad, or for rules based on ijtihad. But it's impossible for us to say that, because that would imply that we have knowledge of divine speech outside of revelation. Okay, so Ghazali is right in his critique of the Mukhatti' insofar as the Mukhatti' posit an independent reality to the ahkam. Does anyone understand what I mean by independent reality? That it actually exists in has some sort of real being in some sort of way. So sort of like the idea of a triangle. Okay. But Razi agrees with Shirazi to the extent that he says that you could not engage in rational thought unless it's purposive, unless it's seeking something. Okay? So how can it be seeking something if we know that that thing does not exist independently? That's the puzzle. So he introduces this idea of al-ashbah. Al-ashbah is what I would say is our recognition, well, what he calls it is that the mujtahid's goal is not the hukm of Allah, because it doesn't exist. Okay? But what it is he tries to speculate about what rule God would have given us. Okay? Had God legislated on it explicitly. That's what the mujtahid is doing. The mujtahid is reaching a conclusion, an opinion about the rule that God would have given us had God revealed the rule to us expressly. That's why it's called al-ashbah. Now this is it's neither a rational judgment, right, nor is it a subjective judgment. Right? It's something kind of in between. Okay? And so that's why I would say this is a kind of example of what I would say is aesthetic judgment, or using aesthetic judgment to explain the practice of ijtihad. Because one of the great problems of the Mukhatti' is it leads inevitably to dogmatism. So if you read al-Mustasfa, which is Ghazali's work on usul al-fiqh, almost all of his arguments, I think, are directed against Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi. So if anybody here knows something about the history of the Shafi'i school, there are two great divisions in the Shafi'i school. There's called the Iraqis and the Khurasanis. So the Khurasanis were they were more inclined to kalam and philosophy, and the Iraqis were more inclined to athar and hadith. Okay? So Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi was Ra'is al-Iraqiyin. He was the head of the Iraqi school. Ghazali was even though he came from Khorasan, that's not what made him a Khurasani. He was a student of Juwayni, so he was a follower of the rationalist madhab within the Shafi'is. Okay? And his main criticism of Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi and his tradition was that the way they did usul al-fiqh, they would say things like the following: al-aslu fil amri al-wujub, al-aslu fil atlaqi al-haqiqa, etc., etc., etc. So what they would try to do is reduce the Arabic language, among other things, to a set of rules. If you're thinking, some of you might be computer scientists or something, you're trying to create an algorithm, right, which would allow you to decode maqsood al-shara', right? So we assume that every word is used in its proper denotative sense. We assume that every command is used to mean obligation. We assume, etc., etc., etc. Now, Ghazali says this is a problem to anybody who knows Arabic, for example, because the Arabic language is much richer than these people imagine it to be. They want to reduce it to a whole set of rules, right? So it's just sort of, again, I would say, so you could reduce it to a computer algorithm, right? And it couldn't give you the correct answer. And that's kind of what follows from the idea that God's rules have an independent, objective existence outside of the interpreter. On the other hand, Ghazali's radical subjectivism ultimately leads to a kind of solipsism, because it says ultimately that there's no real basis for mutual dialogue about what these rules should be, or what this equivocal evidence should mean. And so Razi adopts a synthetic position, it's a synthesis of the two, and says, well, it's objective to the extent that we can have a judgment about what a perfect being would have legislated. But that's not a question of rational proof like we would have in mathematics or something. Okay?
Thank you.
So I'll stop here. There's a lot of other things I could talk about. I want to talk about al-qarafi and much more on substantive law. But there's
Please do.
okay.
Yeah.
So this is
That's very interesting.
this is the nature of the hukm that we attribute to God, right? I'm just giving you a synopsis of the debate about the reality of the hukm